So our first session this morning is the research report on the research that's being done. So we'll have the UW team. We're then to present in the order of the grants. So the UW team will talk first, and then we'll have Eric will talk about what OSU is doing, and then we'll have Patrick talk about the joint grant with the three universities. And they'll have a Q&A after each of their discussions. So you'll have a chance to talk, and then we'll have a break after that. Okay.
Thanks, Kent. John, you can fire up the presentation. Yeah. Thanks. So I was told that I am the one, when that person gets the mic, you have to call the security. But I think Kent overdid me. So good job, Kent. I'm Indranil Ganguly. I'm a faculty member at the University of Washington School of Environmental and Forest Sciences. And once we have the presentation ready, so what we'll be doing, I'll be just introducing the project, and then Nick here, who is doing a master's thesis on this research, collected all the data, did amazing work, but he's defending next month. So I don't want to praise him too much, but you guys will see how good of work he did. But if you want to learn more about his work, actually the defense section of the defense is open. So he can send you an invitation, and you guys can join remotely and listen to his talk, the full version. So here he will only talk for 15 minutes, but during his defense, he can talk for 40 minutes and give more detail. And people are also allowed to ask questions before the open session ends. So you'd be more than welcome to join that meeting as well. So I already introduced myself, and then Greg will. Greg is basically, so it's in the order. I wrote the proposal with Kent and a few other folks, and then Nick and Greg were doing the research. I was almost like clueless what they're doing. So Greg is clued in what they were doing. So Greg will talk about the problems we faced and address those. So, all right, the presentation is up. Should I say next, or do you? Yeah. Okay. So you can go to the next slide. So the order in which I think, and Kent already told that story of how we started doing maple syrup project. This guy called Mike Farrell from nowhere called us and said, "Oh, guys should look at maple syrup." And I said, "No, we don't do maple syrup. We are foresters. We do sustainable forestry, environmental assessment. We don't do food." So, I can. Is it okay if I click? And
sure, yeah.
I don't know how.
Use this.
Okay, so you can click a few times. Okay, just click a few times. The way I started reading, and I was in Thailand doing some international research. Kent was in China also doing some international research, and Mike Farrell was in New England, New York somewhere. And Kent said, "Let's talk to this guy. Let's see what he has to." So it was 11 p.m. for me, and I was totally kind of ready to go to bed. And it was, I don't know what time it was in China, and so we had this discussion. And then I thought, he makes sense. He's saying things that make sense. Let's start looking. And then I looked and realized that most of the maple trees in Washington are in riparian zones, and we have a policy where we don't harvest. We keep the riparian zones intact. And if we do FSC certification in our forest lands, which is an environmental certification, the riparian zone increases. And then there are fewer trees that, especially for small landowners, can harvest. So I thought it's a perfect fit. Let's look into it. And then we wrote the proposal, we got it. So, and then I started reading about maple syrup, and it seems like WSU, OSU have done a lot of research on that, and a lot of volunteers, enthusiasts has been doing research. So I would put it, this is all research. I do think these are all solid research. And then I put Niels there as a researcher because what he did, he almost, if I'm not wrong, he's the first one who showed that it can be done commercially. We are doing it, we are doing the work, and actually reading Niels' work actually motivated me to put a proposal, and because it worked. So Neil is a researcher, of course, and then we started our project in 2019, focused on riparian zones, and then OSU got in the 2020 project, and click one more time, and then we got this 3 projects together. And it's amazing. We have 50% of Pac-12 North here and 1 from Pac-12 South. So we have Utes, Beavers, Huskies, Cougars, and all in this room. So uh, no Ducks, that's a good thing. Sorry, any Ducks fan. Uh, so, uh, uh, so, uh, So our focus is on commercial production, not voluntary commercial, and identifying the feasibility of commercial production. Click one more time. I'll just quickly introduce the project team. It's, of course, me and Kent over there. And I want to just mention one thing. Kent has been talking nonstop since yesterday. But Kent did so much legwork for this project. Oh my goodness, this conference today is possible because of Kent's extreme hard work. And my office is across the hallway from Kent's, and he worked so hard. So I think you applause for everybody, but Kent deserves an applause. Thank you, Kent. And amazing. It's not just he's my boss. I don't, but I'm not saying it because he's my boss. Just want to make it sure. So. So there's another center which is up in Peninsula, Olympic Peninsula. It's ONRC. And Dr. Bernard Borman is also part of the team. There's some work over there. Greg Ettel is, of course, back for as part of the team. WFFA, Elaine, can you raise your hand? Elaine is our outreach, connecting us to the landowners, taking our message to the landowners, and amazing work. And then, of course, Nick, who is the one who is doing the work and knows a lot more about maple syrup than any of us at this point. And Rand Hall, Jeff Rupert. Where is Jeff Rupert? He's not here yet. So Jeff Rupert is quite an influencer. He's a Facebook group, and he also got featured in some of the news articles. Neil McLeod and Devin Day. They're, of course, a part of the team. Patrick Schultz of WSU, part of the team. Victor Nimzek, he'll be here, I think, but Nick Samero is here, also works with Victor, and they're part of the team. Peterson is up in Forks. We did not produce a lot of there, and Rich Weiss, who's the last incumbent or last person to join our group, but also he's doing really good work. And I think he'll talk to you guys later. So next slide. Maybe. Hopefully. Okay, so our project looked at vacuum sap collection system, vacuum pump, where we are actually doing our electrical pump, and then gravity system. And then the temperature pattern, sap flow, tree characteristics, breaks by season, and all those things Nick will talk about. I will skip those. The whole idea is developing an economic feasibility, if it really can be done commercially. That was our focus. And again, I keep harping on the commercial aspect because that was our focus all the time. And then assess the overall bigleaf maple production potential in Washington State. And Nick will talk all about that. So, Nick?
Sweet, thanks, Indra. He might have hyped me up a little bit too much. I don't know much about this. You can go to the next slide. But I have been, I think one more actually.
I had this. sorry, I'll just, I forgot I had this. So this map actually shows where the big leaf maple trees are. And the darker shades, it's Washington, focusing on Western Washington. The darker shades are most abundant with big leaf maple than the lighter shade. So you see that the I-5 corridor kind of has the big leaf maple there. Click one more time. And what we looked at is we looked at how many potential sites. A site would be in a 4-acre square pixel if we can tap 100 trees or 100 taps in a 4-acre pixel. We thought it's a commercially viable site. So based on that, King County has most of those, but there's so this site. So we identified 19,000 potential sites that is possible. But then again, Nick will talk about it's on an average anywhere between less than 1% to 4% is what we can expect based on historical data. But I just wanted to show you that Washington seems to have huge potential, but how much we'll be able to capture that, that's a different story. Sorry, Nick, now you're on.
No worries. You could go to the next slide. Thanks. One more. One more. It should go to a totally new slide. There we go. Cool. Okay, so we've gotten to know the landowners who collaborated on the study a little bit, but in the interest of getting some individual tree level data, that's a red alder, I'm sorry. So in the interest of doing that, we have an individual tree experiment here at Pack Forest, a short walk up the road from here. So it's using these canisters, which are a way to collect sap from an individual tree. It's a fancy bucket. And they're run with full vacuum the entire season. There's about 20 of them all day. And this is kind of an idealized sugar bush. So there's not too many connections to keep track of, right? It's easy to find leaks, and you've got continuous high pressured vacuum going for the whole season. In this case, it was just mid-January to early March. So obviously not as long as one could tap, but this is kind of to see what is, the higher range of potential coming off of one individual tree. You could go to the next slide. So I looked at a couple of different tree characteristics to kind of see what tracks with sap volume and sugar content. And that was diameter on the x-axis here, but also whether or not a tree is growing in a clump or if it's an individual stem. And that could include like coppices or just multi-stem trees. They all counted as clumps. And then also canopy health and canopy position. So a dominant tree getting more sunlight or a suppressed tree getting no sunlight at all. Those I didn't have enough variation in those two canopy characteristics to make any conclusions here. But if you just take a look at sap volume on the y-axis in liters and then diameter at breast height in centimeters on the x, you can see a kind of messy but positive linear trend. The size of the dots is the sugar content, the volume weighted sugar content for each of these trees. And the sugar content didn't really seem to vary by diameter or growth form. Next slide, please.
There's some non-foresters in the room. Maybe you could real quickly explain what high vacuum is and what DVH is.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Yeah, so diameter at breast height is just the diameter of the tree at 4.5 feet off of the ground. And we kind of use it as an indicator for how big a tree is. It's easy to measure. And full vacuum is, I think we were averaging like above like 22 or 25 inches of mercury with the maximum like theoretically possible being 29. And that's opposed to, I guess, other kinds of pumps you could use that are less expensive, less powerful, and might get you to under 20 inches of vacuum. So if you split up the data by growth form, these red dots are now the clump trees. So same information, but split up by the clump trees and the individual trees. You can see that the individual trees now form a pretty tight linear relationship, increasing in sap volume with diameter. And the clump trees are a lot messier, and I think there could be a reason for this. My hunch, and this is not proven, is that the stems in a clump are sharing sap. So that would kind of account for their ability to have higher sap flow, but also a higher variation in sap flow. So if you had, a clump tree with just 2 stems, and you measured a stem that was 32 inches diameter, maybe it's that big red dot right there. But maybe if it had 8 stems, you'd be getting a lot more sap, but you wouldn't know that from just measuring the diameter, right? And so that has a couple of implications for tapping. Next slide. Yeah.
So how did you measure your clump, in your clump, go back to that. The diameter, is that the average diameter of all the trees
That's just the diameter of the stem that was tapped. That's right. And so some of these share clumps. So a couple of these dots are from the same clump. But even so, I think there were 4 different individual clumps tapped, and even tapping multiple stems in a clump still yielded way more sap than any of the individual trees, no matter the diameter. Sure. One more back. Yeah. Previous, if you can. I'm just going to confuse everyone. This one?
Yeah, so, I didn't quite understand this one. Are these individual trees or clumps too?
This is the same data, but this isn't split. This is just not splitting anything, not visualizing anything by clump or individual. So you're just looking at each stem without any distinction.
So what was the final conclusion? It didn't matter because you have some big ones on the smaller side and some big dots on the other side. So
Mm-hmm.
you just said that the bigger diameter, the more oil you got, but that would seem to be the case here.
If you split it up by clump versus individual, the point I'm trying to illustrate is that the clump trees have a lot more variation in sap flow, but generally are still higher than individual trees. And with any individual tree or clump tree, you're likely to get more sap at a higher diameter. We had a little bit of data. I'm sorry, the question was if there were any studies on south-facing versus north-facing taps. And we had a little bit of data on that, but it wasn't enough to make any conclusions because the site that we were looking at is, maybe a couple of 100 yards long. There's not too much variation in there.
And just one thing I wanted to mention, we will have a short Q&A, so we can go through the topics quickly, slides quickly, and try to keep 5 minutes for Q&A
Cool.
at the end, so we can pose our questions to Q&A. Thank you.
And you can go 2 more. Yeah, thanks. And so that was kind of the tree level characteristics that I took a look at. The second question is looking at weather and the timing of sap flow. So it was pretty hard to get kind of a daily prediction of, okay, sap is definitely going to come out of the tree today, right? And part of that has to do with the collection period. So you're not out there actually collecting sap every day. So if you collect on Tuesday, you don't know if the sap flowed on Monday or Sunday or whenever you were last out there, right? So the weather variables that I looked at were like minimum temperature, maximum temperature difference, how cold was it yesterday or 2 days ago. And the one that ended up actually being a pretty good predictor of sap flow was how many times was there a freeze thaw event in the last 3 days. So that was the one significant variable that actually did predict sap flow to some extent. So the canister data that I just described, if you pull it together by date, could you go back to the last one? Oh, geez. So the canister data, if you pull it together by dates, you're looking at how each day varied and not how each tree varied. The 3-day freeze thaw cycle, so that's how many times in the last 3 days was there a freeze thaw. That predicts a season total within 10 to 60%. So I know that's kind of a lot of variation, right? But if you combine all the 3 seasons of that canister data and you feed this model what was the weather on each of these days, it predicts the total sap flow within about 30%. So, there's still some variation there, but considering this is kind of a first whack at it, I'm kind of pleased with that. Could you go to the next one? Oh, cool.
Push the button.
Sweet, thanks. Like really hard? That's about as hard as I can press a button. This middle one? Oh, oh shoot.
Okay, never mind.
All right, thanks. So there's less variation, or rather, you're more likely to have a more accurate measurement the more seasons you have pulled together, right? So it's hard to get an individual day nailed down. It's better if you have a whole season you're trying to estimate. It's even better if it's 3 years. So I said, okay, great, let's look at 10 years of weather data, get predictions for each one of those years across all of Washington of how much sap we think is going to flow out of any individual tap, and then average that together. What do we get? So this is a super blown up version of a map of Washington that I put together, where each of these colored pixels represents a 4-kilometer grid where we have a prediction for how much sap per tap you could expect to get at that grid over the course of a whole season. So the range is pretty high. The bright yellow ones are 0 to 40 liters. And the darkest color you can see on there is up to 200 liters. So obviously that's a really huge number. But this is, again, from kind of an idealized maple setup. And the red dots are the sites, the 19,000 sites that Indra was just explaining, where there's over 250 taps per 4-acre plot. So the point of this is kind of to find, okay, where do these potential sites line up with what we think is going to be the best weather setup. So you can see a couple of areas where the red dots and the dark blues overlap. And there's a couple of reasons to go about this. One is to kind of find where would be the best spot to do this, but also if you were going to kind of look at make the analogy to wine and like the denomination or region of origin of a wine, like, okay, well here you might have the Skagit Valley region that looks to be a pretty good spot. And then the last reason for doing this is to kind of see at a statewide level what is the potential for sap flow and thus syrup production. So there's a couple of filters to put on this data, because obviously we're not tapping 19,000 sites and we're not using high vacuum at every one of them, right? So there's a couple of assumptions we need to make before we can get a final value there. And the first one is taps per acre at each one of these sites, and then I said only look at non-industrial private forest. So Weyerhaeuser is probably not going to make maple syrup, unfortunately, or fortunately. So only small forest landowners, and then using Mike Farrell's dissertation, finding a tap utilization rate. So that's, of all these feasible sites, how many do we think someone could use? Let's say if Washington went the way of Vermont or went the way of Iowa, like how is this going to go down? So 5.8% is the number of feasible taps, not ideal taps, but feasible taps that Vermont was using as of about 10 years ago. So that's the upper range of the estimate here. And the lower range is one of the Midwestern states, which was 0.4%. So 0.4% of all of these sites being utilized. So on the high end, it gets you close to 200,000 liters of syrup. On the low end, it's about 14,000 liters of syrup, and that's per year, assuming those two utilization rates. But there's a lot of assumptions that go into this. One of them, including that you have a pretty ideal tapping setup, but that's kind of tempered by these utilization rate assumptions. Go to the next one. Yeah, and so I'm going to wrap this up real quick. But so we have, obviously all these collaborator sites where we have real-time data, and then we have, my models, which are informed guesses. So how do these match up? Here you're looking at the statewide, same map where the statewide predictions of sap per tap on each pixel. So the yellow is not so great areas, dark blue would be the best areas, and the red stars are all of the collaborator sites that we worked with, including us near Pack Forest right there. And we get between, the model tends to overpredict sap volumes, as you probably could guess, because not everyone's using high vacuum, et cetera, et cetera. So that usually comes in at about 200%. Too much sap is predicted. So, however, there was one standout, and that was Neil's site up in Acme, the northmost point on that map, where the predicted sap volume per tap was actually only 14% higher than what was actually harvested out of the trees. So that, to me, that kind of indicates that they're hitting pretty close to potential sap per tap and kind of an idealized setup. But I'm sure they could even blow that out of the water. So yeah, there's a couple of reasons why there's this huge discrepancy between what we think we could get and what we can actually get. And to talk about production a little bit more, I will hand it over to Greg.
Okay, so I guess I have the story of, well, why is this hard? Almost everybody that's here knows why this is hard, but I'll share our perspective, and then maybe we can collectively move in a direction to try to find solutions for that. All right, to start with, of course, bigleaf maple is common, but it's not common in high densities, right? So what I really want are like 4,000 trees really close together near power, right? You know, somewhere where I could just put on the high vacuum and move. But that's challenging to find. Our tapping season is long, which could be super favorable, right? We might be able to start in November and continue into March, but it also gets warm, right? So how many freeze thaw events are we going to have? Nice events, freeze thaw, where the temperature stays cold in between, that would be great, all right? But we don't get that. We get freeze thaw and then it's 54, 55 degrees and everything goes crazy in terms of microbial load and we need to clean, right? So we have that is a challenge for us. We have low sugar content and proportionally, I think, but don't know, more sugar sand, but maybe that's because we have to boil longer and harder to get to concentration. But our sugar sand load is not trivial, right? It's always kind of in our way of trying to get something done. And then getting equipment's a challenge, right? Like it's expensive to get it hauled or you have to go get it. We're repurposing like milk tanks or anything we can find, usually to try to keep processing moving and building out systems. Of course, knowledge too, but we're all working on that. Next slide, please. Okay, I created these flow diagrams, and I have two of them to think about kind of our bottlenecks or our limitations and how we end up not being where we would like to be. All right, so I started with this idea of thinking of having bigleaf maple. For us at Pack Forest, we have almost no bigleaf maple on soils that have clay. All right, so we normally think of these well-drained soils that can fit into the category of holding good stands of bigleaf maple. Two categories really, I would say the best are the river terraces, you know, above that channel migration zone, where you have well-drained soil, but the roots can get to the water table, and sometimes you can have a lot of maple. I think this describes part of what Neil and their clan are dealing with up at Acme. Then there are these colluvial soils or kind of the loosely aggregated, well-drained soils, sometimes on the sides of steep slopes. Wow, we have some steep slopes that we're working, right, which make the work a little bit harder, but you have the advantage here of being able to use some gravity on your side to create your vacuum. Okay, the tree stocking usually isn't very high, and that provides us another challenge, right? That is, we're tapping trees, but we need to connect our trees in a line system, and all of that work is a little bit challenging because we're on steep slopes and we got to connect lines that are meandering and carrying, if you will, a lot of sap volume, which means more line to clean, more things that can go wrong, a tree can fall, etc. So that can be a challenge for us. And then, are the trees near a collection site and power? I don't know why the trees are always in the wrong place, but they are, right? Like they're downhill from where you have electricity, right? They're on the other side of the river. There's always some sort of challenge as to how to get that sap to the place that you want to be processing. And so when Mike came out to visit, he was saying, oh, you know, we're going to find some place, we're going to run it all right to your sugar shack and go in a tank. That's not how it's going, right? Like, you know, there's lots of things that have to be worked on, thinking about pumps, collection tanks, transfer pumps. How are we going to move that sap around to get it clean to our sugaring facility? Next slide, please. Okay, then I'm struck by how poor of a job I do in taking that sap and actually getting syrup. All right, there's this rule of 86 that would suggest I should get much more syrup than I do. And, you know, it kind of goes like this. If we take the gallons of sap that we have, say at 1% sap, and divide it by the bricks, if you will, that's what we expect we're going to get. 1% sap should give us 86 gallons. And you can see how bad the proposition gets, you know, as you lower that bricks. Not even too much, getting down to say like 0.8, I need about 107 gallons to get a gallon of syrup. All right, so it's in our mind that this low sugar concentration is problematic. Next slide. Okay, but I don't get that. All right, so I did a quick calculation for you. And if we had, and these are our numbers that roughly match what we collected over this last year. If we had almost 1% sugar on average for everything that we collected, we would expect that we were going to produce 88 gallons of sap, of syrup for for all the sap we had. Take 88 gallons of sap to get 1 gallon of syrup, sorry. So I would have expected with our 1,407 gallons of sap, which feels much lower than I would like, we would have had 16 gallons, but we didn't. All right, we had 11.2 gallons that actually got into bottles. All right, and the problem there then, of course, is there's efficiency issues. Neil talked about this a little last night with where sugar gets trapped, but this would be 125 gallons of sap per gallon. And so with that feels a lot less productive. And so, I don't know, for me, if it helps at all, when you're working through it and you're expecting a lot more syrup than you're getting, at least know you're probably not alone. Next slide, please. Okay, so tap to bottle, thinking this through. Of course, as we tap trees, usually we've been trying to tap into a freeze event where we know nothing's going to be flowing and we anticipate we at least have one freeze thaw coming. And sometimes we can get a good push or a run of sap coming out. If the weather warms up, the flow starts to slow. Of course, if you have vacuum on those taps, you can keep that flow going for a while, but eventually it starts to slow down. We have tap level problems, right? We start to build up microbial growth within the taps, but also we get the holes themselves trying to close off. The tap really doesn't want an open wound, right? The tree doesn't want that. And so you start to get a slowing of the sap. So this idea of trying to retap and then maybe retap, again, depending on your weather, is known and something that, you know, we're at least thinking about, but getting that right is a little bit tricky, right? Like sometimes you should probably leave the taps in because you're waiting for this frost, and other times you're gonna have to retap. All right. Are your lines tight? Do you have any leaks? There's always a leak somewhere, right? Isn't there? And how do you know where that leak is? And trying to keep track of all that and being really fastidious in walking your lines and looking for those leaks. You got to be out there doing it. I'm not doing that very well, right? I have other people that would do that for us. Okay, vacuum pump. Is it possible? Is it operable? That is, if you have a vacuum pump that's out in an area where you don't have power, that means you're either using batteries or you're running a generator. Did the fuel run out, right? Are your batteries dead? Did something go wrong with the pump? Keeping that continuous vacuum on the lines is a super big challenge. And obviously you're going to lose production if you can't get that. Are things clean? Oh, by the way, you got to service these pumps too, and so sometimes they're just out of service. Are things clean? This is a big one for us. Are your lines clean? You know, do you have leaf litter in your tanks? Do you have some film, biofilm building up? Are your transfer tanks clean? Right? I can remember a time like just watching a bunch of junk come out of a transfer tank, moving sap into another tank. Like, well, that's great, right? Like you certainly need to try to keep everything clean and rinsed throughout. Are your lines flowing? Lines get blocked by wood chips from your tapping, you know, or contamination, and trying to do those repairs to keep everything going is needed. Then in the sugar shack, is the RO clean? Like how many gallons of sap have you processed? Do you have time to get a proper wash and rinse in before you're gonna have more sap? And when it's warm, do you have time to clean? Evaporator, sometimes it's full of pre-syrup. There's not enough sap, right? And you can't push it through. What are you gonna do? Sugar sand and niter buildup. The sugar sand is killing me sometimes, especially with our drop flu. And you know, you have that sand sitting in there full of sugar, and then you fire up the evaporator again. Little tricky business, right? And do we have enough pre-syrup to even filter? I don't know, I can't even get glassware sometimes. I don't know about you, like getting glassware this year was a big challenge. Everything needs to be ordered months out, and especially if it's coming from the East Coast. Okay, next slide. All right, so some sap never gets processed. If we have low volumes, a lot of times we just can't get to it, or there's nobody to work on it. Somebody calls in sick, or somebody's gone, or somebody needs a rest. I'm in Seattle. Some things just don't happen. Low quality sap, you go to the tank and it's spoiled. All right, well, this is something you probably want to dump. Low daily volumes, non-continuous flows. It's this thing where you've got either way too much sap all at once, the best problem, or you have these little amounts that just keep coming. What to do with 50 gallons of sap a day? I almost rather have no sap a day, right? You know, and get 200 in one day, but it doesn't come like that. Running the RO makes sense to concentrate the sap when you have small volumes. Where's it going? Getting our tanks to match up right, I mean, up to each other is a little bit different from the East Coast models, meaning we're starting with lower sugar, so we have an enormous volume of sap that has to go into a relatively small concentrate tank. So getting that to work and having the RO power to do it is important. And then getting your evaporator size to match. You know, like I think I talked Mike into making sure we got a bigger evaporator with big aspirations, but we might be better with a smaller evaporator. It takes us about 300 gallons just to pack the sugar into that thing. And then once it's in there, we have to either keep getting sap or we have to move it out and store it and then put it back in as we're working. Do you leave the syrup in the evaporator? Like this pre-syrup, sometimes it's really cold, the windows are open, the room is near freezing, we just leave it for a day or two and then start up again. But other times as it starts to get warm, we pull everything out of the evaporator and put it in a cooler, right? And then come back to it when we get some more sap so that we can keep everything fresh. Okay, I think that one last slide and I'm gonna be done. All right, so what to do? Well, I don't know. This comes to all of us, all right? So move sap to the evaporator regularly or get insulated tanks. Like I don't want it to sit out there too long, but sometimes when it's really cold up the hill, I just want to keep it out there instead of bringing it into camp where it's a few degrees warmer and transferring it might cause a problem. Clean, 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 clean. Just constantly trying to keep the lines clean. Flushing lines, back flushing lines, scrubbing tanks, scrubbing everything within the sugar shack, rinsing out all the lines in the sugar shack as well. Like all these places where contamination can build up. Pre-syrup moved on and off the evaporator. Brian Reed, when he came this year, he's like, oh, don't you guys have a brew pump? I'm like, brew pump? What a fantastic idea, right? So then we were able to start moving some pre-syrup around, which was really helpful for us. Otherwise, I was stuck and losing even more in the process. Food grade pails, our refrigerator, terrific. We're storing quantities of near syrup, like 50%, 55%, and we might build up 10 gallons of that and then filter it all at once because the filter press needs to be matched to the syrup. And, you know, a lot of the gravity feed type systems are more challenging. And we need help with innovation, right? We need to think through how could we best design the combination of tanks, all right, the actual partitions within the tanks to maximize flow. Where would we be able to chill things? Where do we need to make sure we're getting a hard boil, and how can we pull everything off and get it to work? So I think we have opportunities there. All right, what time were we supposed to finish?
So we were supposed to finish at 9, but then we started late. We can still have, I think, 5 minutes. Ken, is that okay? 5 minutes of question answer. He said okay.
Greg, can you repeat any questions if they can't hear the audience on the video?
Yes, sir. Questions? Yeah.
What do you mean by free syrup and bricks and the brew pump?
Sure. So if we talk about syrup, we're thinking 66.5% is syrup. So that would be 66.5 bricks, just in other lingo. So pre-syrup before it actually is bottled or at syrup concentration. Oftentimes we're working with this material that's on the evaporator that's not quite syrup. If it was on the evaporator right until it was 66.5%, and it came off of the evaporator right into a tube that went right through the filter press into an automatic bottling system, I mean, like something like that, I can't envision that working for us, but that would be the ideal. Instead, what you end up with is, oh, it's 54% or 54 bricks, and you're worried that it's going to start to burn somewhere, and you're shutting down the evaporator and pulling something off, or you're out of sap to enter the evaporator. If more sap isn't flowing in, then things are going to start to burn somewhere. You got to keep a depth in those pans, or you have a problem. Okay, I think that was it. Other questions? Yeah.
What animal disruptions can you typically expect? Deer, raccoons, squirrels?
Yeah, so is Brian here? Brian has bears. So we thankfully haven't had bear disruptions, but that was my initial worry. Like they're stripping the bark off of trees. Don't they want the sap, right? So we've had some squirrel damage. I think that's really quite common. The way the story is told to me, if you're using bleach and not rinsing, the salts are pretty attractive, and sometimes they'll get in there. I'd say our biggest problem are human animals. You know, like they're hiking on a trail that now a line crosses, and they've decided this is offensive and not what they want, and they break a line or something. The elk sometimes cause people big problems. I guess one last question.
High wind events are catastrophic almost. Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah, okay, so I didn't repeat the other question too. The other question was what animals are a problem, but hopefully people could infer that on the tape from what I said. Now the comment was wind. Wind is definitely a big deal for us. It's a bigger deal than animals. Well, at least it has been, because we have a lot of storms. You know, it's pretty common to have 3, 4, 5, 6 storms a year where 30, 40 mile an hour winds. And maple branches breaking off and landing on lines is to be expected, I would say. Yes?
Did you notice that your bricks content for the sap changed throughout the year? Because mine started out higher than it was growing as the season went on.
Yeah, the question is, does the bricks change throughout the year, starting high and going lower? Nick, do you want to take that? Because I think you're closest to the data to know.
For the data that we have that's consistent and taken in one site, and that's starting in middle of January, it started off at like 1.5% and then probably wound up at 0.8 or so, and that's by like March. Did find a study though from 1970 near Corvallis where it starts off in November about 0.8, rises, peaks at around the same time and then drops. So it's good to know nothing's shifted horribly yet. That might have been it, right?
I think there's one question here, real quick question. You talked about tap closure, like when the tap's been in the tree for a while, it's been over, whether or not you pull a tap or drill a new tap. So is there a rule of thumb to how long a tap is going to last in a tree, and does vacuum affect that significantly?
Okay, so the question is there a rule of thumb of how long a tap should sit in a tree? I'll pass it to Neil in just a second because I think he has a better feel for how long he thinks taps should sit. I feel now after 3 seasons that retapping once at least feels right for us. But that's because we usually can't quite commit to tapping until really close to the holiday season, right? Like somebody could start tapping before Thanksgiving if they had the weather, but it's this combination of university holidays and things and thinking, wow, maybe we should just wait until after the Christmas break and then tap trees. That comes up. Now, having said, when do you know, like any taps that have something yellow, they got to get pulled, right? You've got stuff coming in immediately. And when you start to see your lines getting cloudy, and you got sap, it just starts to say, wow, we really should sanitize. And that gives you this incentive to start, pulling taps or cutting lines and moving it. So yeah, that's it. So Neil, do you have a feel for?
Yeah, we tap 3 times a year. We tap probably beginning of December. I was hoping, you had tap
December 10th, I retapped again in January, and I retapped on mid-February. Pretty much you figure out you're retapping 3 times a year. Every time you get a warm cell, your taps are going to fill up on your retap. And if it's bad, I will put on new taps. I want them.
Okay, so I'm just going to fill that in for the people that wouldn't be able to hear it on recording. All right, so what Neil said is that he's typically retapping 3 times a year, starting maybe in November, and then again in December, and then in January. But if in fact the temperature gets really warm, that might be a driving point where something starts to go bad and initiate a retapping event. So depending on kind of the flow of the weather events for that year, that might dictate when they retap. Was that?
2 years ago, we had that warmer than average winter. I tapped 4 times. We kept getting mid-50s, and that would kill the bacteria you had to tap.
Yeah.
When you retap, do you tap from where the drop goes in the line, or do you just cut the tap off and put on a new tap on the?
Tap out. If I'm looking at my dropper, if I have a lot of bacteria in that dropper, I'm going to change the whole thing out, move over 4, down 4, and then go. My droppers are at least 3 feet long, so I got a lot of room to move around in that tree.
Okay, Rich?
Just flip the tap off? I mean, sometimes
If I've got really serious, I've got a lot of buildup of bacteria, I'm cutting that tap off. I do reuse my taps, so you know, clean taps where I soak them in a chlorine for a few days and then brush them, wash them out really well. Since it's so hard to get equipment, I reuse as much as I can.
Okay, so to try to backfill that in, that's what I was trying to yeah, so because we have a lot of chatter going back and forth that I don't think people at home will be able to pick up when they're watching this later, is the question was, which is a really good question, how do you go about the retapping process? Are you pulling taps? Are you working all the way back to the drops? And sometimes maybe even working to changing out teas depending on where the contamination is. So I think that's sort of the answer. It's depending on where the problems might be. And then Neil also shared that 2 years ago, the weather was a lot warmer than it was this year or the year before, and he retapped 4 times. So, you know, that kind of goes with this idea of thinking of when are you going to be engaged in sanitation and when might you be collecting sap. Okay, with that, I'm going to try to get us closer to schedule. So thank you.